Hello, I'm Kate Inkle. I'm the Policy and Campaigns Manager for Wheels for Wellbeing, which is a disabled people's cycling organisation.
Thank you. And Kirsty?
Good morning, I'm Kirsty Hoyle. I'm the CEO of Transport for All, which is a disabled people's organisation, a national organisation that works across different impairment groups to get access to transport and streets for disabled and older people.
And Georgia, sorry, wrong mute button.
Hi all, I'm Georgie Exley, so I'm Head of Cities for UK and Ireland at TIR. I've worked in the micromobility sector internationally for about 5 or 6 years now. So really working in partnership with cities to bring forward sustainable and active travel solutions.
Lovely, thank you all for joining us for today's session. And this first theme that we're looking at is around justice and inclusion. And so please feel free to answer any or all of the questions. But the first one is, what would be a just way of distributing funding for walking, wheeling and cycling across policy areas and delivery agencies? I'm not sure who would, anyone like to go first? Okay, well volunteered.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm glad that a just way of funding was mentioned in this, because Wheels for Wellbeing, well, we're a cycling organisation. Part of our wider ethos is around mobility justice. So that's about just access to all kinds of mobilities for everybody. So if we think about it, 15 to 20% of the population have a disability, of course, depending on how you measure disability. But certainly 15% of public transport and active travel infrastructure isn't provision specifically for disabled people. And in many schemes, in many transport infrastructure, 0% is actually provision for disabled people. So what you have then is a transport and active travel infrastructure that is actually geared towards people who already have the most mobility privilege, the most mobility options, and in the most well-resourced areas. And people with the least mobility have the least resources provided to them. And that's both in terms of their demographics and in terms of the regions where they're located. So this creates an injustice, but also a deficit. There's an underlying deficit in access to mobilities of all kinds. And that remains within the active travel and public transport infrastructure. So if we were going to talk about a just way of funding CWIS2, I suppose I could argue that 15 to 20% of the funding at least should be specific provision towards disabled people. And I can imagine a collective gasp of horror at that, but I think that's really interesting when we think about that is the proportion of the population. But that doesn't then overcome the historical deficit in mobility options. So I think to give some straightforward answers, there needs to be a direct target of active travel and micromobilities for disabled people in CWIS2, and there needs to be measurable outcomes set. There needs to be a specific funding stream that's targeted towards meeting those outcomes. So we want to see this amount of active travel journeys by disabled people in all regions, and we're allocating this funding to do it. There needs to be a funding stream for innovative projects that are looking at things that haven't been tried before or that are currently in their infancy in terms of pilots. So hire schemes for non-standard cycles, which are being trialled in London and in other parts of the country at the moment, and throw up all kinds of challenges in terms of even things like delivering non-standard cycles to people and storing them. And there needs to be a real focus on also hooking up public transport systems with active travel for disabled people as well. So that means allowing all kinds of mobility aids on public transport on a daily basis without the inconvenience of having to pre-book, ensure there's ramps and space. So if we're really talking about active travel for disabled people, this is not only the active travel mobility options in itself, but it's also making sure that they're compatible with public transport. And then finally, in terms of just funding, there is also an issue that's really significant related to this, and I think you were going to come on to it in another question, so I won't go on at length about it now, but the other massive issue is cost. So non-standard cycles cost thousands, usually about the price of a second-hand car. And when we consider that disabled people usually experience a massive employment and pay gap, as well as an education gap, disabled people are usually in the least likely position to be able to afford an expensive piece of mobility equipment. So there's a whole issue of cost, but I think we're going to look at that separately. So I'll save that for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kay. Kirsty, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I did, and thank you, Kay, for setting out the wider context so brilliantly. I think if we're looking at a quantitative case, I think you've really set both the qualitative and the quantitative there in terms of the people that we're talking about. I think a step before that for me, before looking at figures and so on, is that I don't think we agree what we're talking about. You know, if I looked at the questions for this inquiry, one of them stated that justice and inclusion, walking and cycling are the most accessible forms of transport. So that could be a 3-day conference for people like me and Kay and Georgia, just that statement. So I think that we need to step back a second and we need to have a collective agreement about by what measure something is accessible before we can start to set any targets or look at how we attribute funding to making things accessible. Because I wouldn't agree with that statement necessarily, and others might. So I think we need to step back a moment. And the reason, as Kay has identified, we are now, there is a new agenda, which I think disabled people are being left out of, and they're being pushed into conflict with them as a citizen who cares about active travel, the ability to move and to lessen their impact on the environment, but their needs to go to the post office or to see their nan. You know, people are being forced into conflict as an individual versus a citizen with a collective responsibility. So I think we do need a little more research and thought around this area, and then we can start coming to agreements where we can be held accountable. So if we're then looking at how we send out funding and how we then work with delivery partners, if we all have a collective agreement about what we're trying to achieve and the landscape on which it sits, which is already inaccessible for the majority of disabled people at certain points on certain modes, then we know where we are. Then we can look at specifics, deliverables, such as a set of standards for delivery partners. You know, we're just about to, which I'm really excited about, we're about to launch partnerships with both Sustrans and Living Streets, who are two organisations who are two of the big delivery partners for active travel, because they identified a skills gap within their organisations for really understanding the impact and the potential of these initiatives for disabled people. So for me, it's a step back, it's some thought, a collective agreement, then leading that to accountability, which we can filter down into how we distribute funding and how we set those standards.
Lovely, thank you, Kirsty. And Georgia, do you have anything further?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the same vein, and I think this is the thread that each of us is probably going to carry through the conversation, I think it's about coming back to the detailed and disaggregated data that's really looking at across protected characteristics, what is the reality of their access to these forms of transportation. And when I say kind of disaggregated data, I'm not talking about just the hard data and the numbers, but as Kay and Kirsty have alluded to, also including people in that conversation, understanding what the day-to-day experience is and really listening to the data from the lived experience of these groups as well, and not feeling that we kind of understand them deeply from this kind of high level view. And just to kind of come back to the question around the just way of distributing funding, because I think funding is a really important part of this discussion. Currently, there is a huge amount of funding around transport, active transport, sustainability, and it's just not being accessed by all of the groups that should be accessing it. We need to be skewing that funding, and I think this is what both Kirsty and Kay have said as well, skewing that funding to the areas that are currently underfunded. And unless we understand which areas they are, we can't do that skewing, right? So it's going to keep coming back to just making sure we have the detail. on this, I think, there's $250 million in funding towards cycling that's being distributed almost exclusively through local authorities in CapEx projects. That infrastructure is absolutely key, but there will be a plan that's made months and months beforehand, and then it's delivering against that plan. Technology will have moved on, innovation will have moved on, services will have moved on. And those plans are so rigid and so formalized in that CapEx funding, there's no ability to pull from that into just lowering barriers to access. And often lowering barriers to access isn't huge infrastructure projects. It's things like providing a grant or some type of subsidy to allow somebody to be able to purchase an adaptive bicycle, or be able to take a cycle training course, or be able to do an e-scooter safety course. We need to start really looking at what all of the options are and where the barriers are on that disaggregated level. So I think through all the questions that we're going to go through today, it will continue to kind of come back to, do we really understand the experience of these different groups and within people's protected characteristics? Currently, I don't think we do. We have a load of data, but it's not necessarily being pulled into the right conversations at the right point. And yeah, it will just continue to come back to that. It's only with that in hand that we're going to be able to do this justly.
Thank you all very much. It's very detailed and interesting responses. So the next question is specifically to Kirsty. Do you feel the existing safeguards, such as the Equality Act, provide a sufficient guarantee of fairness where walking, wheeling and cycling are concerned? And if not, what specifically do you think is needed?
So no is the answer, and I'll give a brief overview of why and an example. TfL's recent High Court ruling. The Equality Act, the way that it's structured. So I know individual examples can be tedious, but I feel I have to use an anecdotal example to illustrate my point. So we have been working with a local authority who have decided to get rid of all of their blue badge parking in the centre of town in order to allow for more cycle parking and areas for people to sit. This was done without consultation, or any particularly decent consultation. And we only stopped it because a member of ours chatted to us and we spoke to a human being and said, this isn't a great idea. They had also not put any mitigating factors into place. They hadn't thought about, maybe we could move parking here. It was a kind of war on cars, which is there's a moral certainty around that in our culture at the moment, which I think we need to be mindful of when it comes to disabled people's needs. And in that particular example, we could have used the Equality Act or the PSED to make that change. But for the Equality Act to work, I would have had to have found one disabled person or someone with a protected characteristic who I could prove was discriminated against specifically by that measure. Now, the individual toll that takes on that person, the infrastructure that we have to fund and pay for to support to find that person, to then find the legal aid funding to connect with if it's the HRC or one of our sort of legal partners, to make that happen, to stop that change happening, is enormous. So the system doesn't work when it comes to the Equality Act because it's too onerous, it's too individualistic, and also it tends to be retrospective. So it works for something over a period of time, but it won't stop it happening next week. The second, sorry, it's my Siri. I've got a loud voice. The second option is PSED. So we might think, right, we're going to get you on the Public Sector Equality Duty Act, okay? But then what we'd be looking at is your consultation process. And this is pretty esoteric as well, because a proof of consultation is undefined and subjectively interpreted. So, for example, one local authority or one organisation might be able to prove that they had a level of consultation that's deemed sufficient. However, but again, similar to my criticism of the comment on the questions, by what measures? So no, they don't work, is the answer. And we are placed again into conflict rather than as positive partners when it comes to these initiatives. So short of a change in the law, which I don't think we're going to have next week, but there are things we can do next week. Again, I'm afraid it does come back to understanding what people want, how much it costs, and what the appetite is for balancing trade-offs. So, and this is where I think we need a far more rational and dispassionate view of what people get access to and what they don't, and when it's fair and when it isn't. I understand the power of running a disabled people's organisation in our current climate, and I think we mustn't underestimate that or misunderstand it. So I don't get ignored because I represent disabled people, but it doesn't mean that I get listened to and that we're genuinely part of the engagement. And I think that needs to change. People are scared because our current climate, we all know why. I don't need to dig into that. And that's okay as a door pusher in it now, but it isn't enough to really change that. And I tend to find that most people who are running LTN schemes, low traffic neighbourhood schemes, looking at a cycle pathway, it's kind of a group of cushions. They tend to bear the impression of the last person who sat on them when it comes to inclusion. And by that I mean, if you've got a large lobby in your area of visually impaired people, or you have a school for deaf children near you, you tend to bear the impression of the people who've spoken to you. And there's two reasons for that. One, because we're not a genuinely inclusive society when it comes to the people with power. And the second is that we haven't got our house in order. If you're a local authority or you're the DFT trying to engage and look at where you put safeguards in place, how you support people, that the sector that you're speaking to is a charity sector primarily that is truncated by impairment. So you speak to people about visually impaired people, you speak to another organisation about people with mental health needs. And what we're not seeing is a matrix approach where no one is left out, but reasonably, no one can have everything they want all the time. So for me, a real understanding of those different needs, and for everyone, including disabled people, to take that dispassionate view of fairness and realise that as human beings, there is always a trade-off. I think that piece of work needs to be done. And I think it would really set us all free from constantly being in combat over these issues. It's just not terribly easily done.
Thank you, Kirsty. I'm going to hand over to Baroness Barker for the next questions. I'm just aware we've got quite a lot of questions to get through. Thank you, Baroness.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to follow on from Kirsty's point there about who has the primacy when it comes to the design of our streets. Our question is to Kay, really. What does catering for all in our streets really mean when it comes to walking, wheeling and cycling? How do we balance those competing demands that were just mentioned in design?
So I think there's 4 aspects to it. And the first is straightforwardly in how you conceptualize streets and who they're for. So it's interesting, in this panel, we're actually talking about cycling, walking and wheeling, whereas actually in the actual funding, the title of the funding stream, there's no wheeling mentioned at all. And I think it's really important to start with a conceptualization that explicitly includes disabled people, because if you just say walking and cycling, to the majority of people's imagination, that's an able-bodied person, most likely a white man, trotting along the pavement with a latte or hopping onto an e-scooter or something. So you're already creating an expectation or an imagination in which disabled people don't exist and aren't part of this infrastructure. So, I mean, we would argue that adding wheeling, and it's an imperfect term, and it doesn't incorporate in its literal sense all disabled people, but at least if you add that term to the strategy, it is telling people, it's telling designers, planners, funders that disabled people are a part of this. And it's also telling disabled people, okay, this is about us, because again, I think a lot of the resistance emerges from disabled people's experiences. Every time there's a low traffic neighbourhood designed or a new scheme, disabled people are not thought of, are not included, and it's going to create more and more barriers and obstacles. So I think just the conceptualization, the way it's written and spoken about, that somehow acknowledges the existence and the inclusion of disabled people, is really important. I think the other aspect of it is second aspect is how we think about infrastructure, and there needs to be 3 dimensions of infrastructure. So first of all, we need accessible pavements. Pavements are for people using non-amplified form of travel. So this might be a manual wheelchair, it might be someone walking with a cane or a rollator, it might be someone with an assistance dog, it might be someone just walking along. But these pavements, in order to be properly accessible, also need standards to them. So it's things that are about surface, width, camber, quality, cut curbs, tactile paving, all of those things. So it's almost like what we need in order to just have the walking and wheeling bit catering for everybody is like we need an LTM 120 for pavement standards, and that needs to be enforced. And that also includes regulations around businesses and street clutter and all the things that we see spilling all over the pavements as we're now having sort of outdoor dining that make it completely inaccessible for anybody who isn't just walking unassisted. So it's about starting with pavements for non-amplified travel. And then next to that, you need a segregated mobility lane. That's the renaming of cycle lanes to, again, include a wide range of amplified mobilities. And this would include everything from e-scooters that people stand on, mobility scooters that people sit on, skateboards, all kinds of cycles. So your regular bicycle to a hand cycle to a recumbent. So all the kind of forms of amplified travel. And again, we already have an LTM 120 standard for this. It needs to be segregated, of course. It needs to be wide enough for a range of cycles, etc. It needs to be segregated from both the pavement and the road, but also accessible from the pavement. So again, we have to think about how we make those transitions between different forms of mobilities. It's no good having a mobility lane for a fast mobility scooter if you can't get off the pavement into it, for example. And then the third aspect of it is then the sort of traditional road, which is for motor vehicles, should be 20 miles an hour in residential areas, no pavement parking or mobility lane parking. And there needs to be lots of provision for blue badge holders. There still needs to be parking for disabled people. And again, it's been mentioned before, there's almost been this sort of war on cars, which is now making it acceptable to remove parking spaces from disabled people. And that might be disabled people that need to park a car, or it might be needing to be dropped off. So we need to think about incorporating those spaces in and not making someone get out of a car and then have to cross a busy mobility lane and get onto a pavement. So it's really about thinking about how we design all of these three aspects for everybody. And that links to the third and fourth points, really, which is about the culture around design and how we think about things. So at the moment, transport infrastructure seems to be based almost very much in a colonial mentality. It's like the bigger, the more powerful, the stronger you are, the more you will dominate space and take that space and assume your right to be there. And the less power, the more vulnerable you are, the more you will be squashed out of those spaces. So even when we think about things like pavement parking or people driving in cycle lanes, it's this sort of mentality, I've got this big vehicle and I'm going where I want. So we need a complete reversal of that, so that instead of the more power you have with your vehicle, the more you take, it should be the more power you have, the more you defer to space users who have less power and are more vulnerable. So that's a massive cultural shift, but they achieved that in Holland. And Holland used to be a very car-centric culture. If you look at pictures from the 70s, it's jammed. It's very much like lots of big cities in England look now. And they actively work towards changing that culture. So now if you go to Holland, you can see there are pedestrians, all kinds of cyclists and drivers sharing space. And there's nobody at risk because everybody knows that they defer to the person who has less power. So, I mean, that's obviously a long-term piece of work in terms of thinking about our entitlement to space and who we defer to. But we have seen it in other areas of health policy. So, for example, the smoking ban. I mean, when I was a child, you could go to the newsagent by school and they'd break open a box of cigarettes and sell school kids in uniforms individual cigarettes for 10p each. And that was perfectly normal, acceptable, and nobody batted an eye. So, and now it's smoking has become completely unacceptable. So we can change our culture around that. And I think there's a really long-term piece of work that needs to be about how we behave and allocate and see our entitlement in public space.
Okay, we're going to have to move because we've got a lot to get through. And I just want to add on to your point 3 One thing that we need to watch out for is something that's been happening, particularly at motorway service stations, where the blue badge spaces are being turned into electric vehicle charging points because they're nearer the electricity source. So we need to make sure that we're not having a double displacement.
And also, electric vehicle charging points are not made wheelchair accessible. So if you're a wheelchair user driving an electric car, you can't use the charging points. And if I can just sneak in the last point, it's about design consultation. So it's about when we're thinking about all of these things, and it goes back to George's point earlier, is who are we including from the very beginning when we're thinking about all of these things, and needing to think about all people protected characteristics involved in the design and the discussion at the beginning, not after it's been done.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Going over to Georgia, go back to this question about affordability of different sorts of vehicles and different sorts of cycles. We've heard about the cost of non-standard cycles for disabled people. How do we get them more affordable to the people who need them?
Thank you. So yeah, I think the question is about kind of affordable and or attractive for underrepresented groups was the way that it was framed. And actually it's all the above. And I think the first thing that is really important to acknowledge is that we're too often conflating the affordability and accessibility conversation and lumping in all like many protected characteristics into these titles of low economic groups. And it's really vital that we work on that. We need to stop using that as a proxy for talking about race, class, nationality, and start really being honest about what we're talking about there. And I will kind of continue to beat the drum of disaggregated data and that consultation point. Making services more affordable doesn't therefore get Black people cycling. There are plenty that are going to be attracted by the prospect of high-tech carbon fiber bikes that cost more than my rent. The affordability point is really key, but let's be clear about who we're talking about and who we're targeting with that affordability point. And that is across many other characteristics, right? There's an affordability point of how do we make it more affordable for disabled cyclists? How do we make it more affordable for refugees? This is a very different conversation. There's not a blanket approach to each. So it really needs to be a multifaceted one. That high-level marketing campaigns would be great, but they're not going to speak to all groups. So we have to really get to that targeted and specific focus. On the infrastructure side, I think, again, that thoughtful network design, absolutely too often our cities, our transport systems are set up to cater for a specific group, for commuters. And actually what we need to be doing is building dense networks and systems that cater to all journeys and journey types. And that's where the matrix approach that we've each spoken about is really vital. If you introduce, say, a cycle hire or e-scooter service with mandatory parking to make sure that you're not encroaching on city space for other road users, right? You actually then also need to make sure that that parking is a dense network and not limiting the use to only journeys that are taking commuters from one form of transport into the office. You also need to be helping people to access that in different forms and routes. So that density is going to be really important. And that's, again, that matrix approach. One side of the way you build it is about not encroaching on everyone else's space, but the other is about making it actually a valuable and accessible service to wider groups and not just serving one and delivering it. And that, again, is really requiring that people with those lived experiences are in the room, are decision makers and holding funding, and they're the ones that are building our transport networks. Because if we think about who are our transport planners, who are the officers, who are the decision makers, and what are their experiences and values, and where is it leading them in that network design, we'll be really quickly faced with why we're ending up with things like that are completely inaccessible to huge groups of people. So making that accessible, making the funding accessible, requires actually giving it to those people and those groups, and thinking about who's championing this huge investment that is there in the public eye. Is it the same people that are the decision makers and have been the decision makers historically, or can we actually start including some people, other people, into those conversations?
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Fabian, but I'm going to say we are going to have to speed up the answers because we are just not going to get through this if we go in the space. Fabian, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz. My name's Fabian Hamilton. I'm MP for Leeds North East and Treasurer of the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling and Walking Group. And again, this is addressed to Kirsty. And again, I'm going to ask whether you could be as brief as possible because we are out of time. Kirsty, do you think it's appropriate to set targets relating to justice and inclusion in active travel? And if so, what kind of target would be helpful? And if not, why not?
Not yet is the answer, Fabian. And it comes back to my earlier point that I don't think we know what we're talking about yet. And I'll give a very quick example that speaks to George's point. I live in Stoke, okay? So there's a big rural versus, city element that we're not even talking about here in terms of access as well. But if I'm a wheelchair user and I'm a woman and I live in Stoke, it's probably most likely it's because I live in Stoke that I'm not accessing active travel rather than me being a woman or a wheelchair user. So we need to look at that first before we start setting targets around justice and inclusion. So no, not yet, but also yes, because we are often left out of targets. The big push at the moment is for climate justice. Disabled people are being left out of having being able to make good choices as citizens to active, I can't afford a wheelchair hand cycle, I've got to use my car, I'm being left out. So yes, but not yet. We're not at the point where we understand what those justice and inclusion targets would look like for individuals across the UK in different areas.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsty. Very brief response, but very comprehensive. My next question is to Kay. Kay, what should CWIS2 do to increase the affordability of adapted cycles, do you think?
Okay, so I've got a list of 9 things and I'll try and keep them all to about 1 word a piece. So first of all, the Motability scheme. You can get a car, you can get an electric wheelchair, you cannot get an adapted cycle on it. So Motability funding for adapted cycles, that will also require a national infrastructure for supply and repair, which is a bit of another issue, but Motability is one definite option. 2, a VAT exemption on cycles for disabled people, whatever kind of cycle they're using, when that is a mobility aid. 3, look at expanding the cycle to work scheme to low paid and part-time employers, being paid back at a much slower and longer period than it is currently. 4, considering a government-sponsored interest-free loan scheme for non-standard cycles like has been proposed for e-cars. 5, a grant scheme or a voucher scheme delivered through local authorities where disabled people are given a voucher to buy the most appropriate piece of mobility equipment for them. 6, and this is actually sort of an aside, I don't know if you know, the Scottish Government are doing a free bikes for kids who in low-income families, including non-standard cycles. So even if we're thinking about children or a sort of national rollout, something like that might be useful. 7, working with other departments like the Department of Health. So for many people, it's not just about the affordability of the cycle, it's about the affordability of the equipment that you need. So to use a hand cycle, you need a decent rigid frame wheelchair with cambered wheels, pneumatic tires. The NHS don't provide them. In fact, they don't provide active wheelchairs at all. So again, if we're actually talking about active travel for a big group of disabled people, it starts with the NHS providing active, lightweight wheelchairs that people can move in and use a hand cycle attachment. At the moment, if you have an NHS wheelchair, you're not allowed to modify it, and attaching a clip-on hand cycle classes as a modification. So we also need to look at working with the Department for Health. There's also a whole issue around the Department for Work and Pensions, and many people's fear that if they become active, they are going to lose their disability benefits. And there needs to be an understanding that just because you can move in some ways, and at some point, and for some people that might still be very limited, it might be the small pain-free window they have in a week. If they cycle, that doesn't mean that they are suddenly no longer disabled and no longer entitled to benefits and support. So this whole active travel and affordability needs to link up with the other departments that also have a massive impact on disabled people's lives. And that's the Department of Health, and it's the Department for Work and Pensions. And I think that was just 8 points, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Kay. That's very helpful. I'm going to hand over now to Layla Moran.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. So actually the questions I'm just going to initially just put to Georgia, if that's all right. And it's to do with how do we get more women cycling? There is a perception that cycling is the preserve of, non-disabled, wealthy white males. What evidence do we have about the barriers to women? Is it just a question of perception? Is it not? And if not, what can central and local government do to break down those barriers?
Well, I think perception is a really important part of the conversation. To my earlier point of who is championing this in the public eye, 9 times out of 10 at the government or local authority level, and this is what we're talking about here, right? And the funding that's gone into this, 9 times out of 10, the representatives of this are middle-aged white men. More widely in the industry, often maybe a professional competitive female cyclist will sometimes cut through in a campaign, but this still isn't approachable for the everyday cyclist or or somebody that's just thinking about getting into riding. It really feeds through to who is at the table and influencing these discussions. And I think we should recognize really quickly that the makeup of this discussion is a complete anomaly in the active and sustainable transport space, to have this many women in the room. How can we, with so rarely seeing women, and particularly women of colour, in this space, how can others be expected to really break into it or thrive in it or participate even as an end user if there's no influence there in the industry itself? So really, I think it's going to keep, and that's, going down to the perception level, but at every level, we really need to look at the makeup of the decision makers, where the funding is going, who's holding it, and whether that's actually reflective of the groups that we're saying we want to serve with it. So we need more female, minority transport planners, officers, CEOs, founders, spokespeople. Let's look at the makeup of who's in these conversations, and that will trickle down through the rest of the conversation.
And in terms of specific barriers, I mean, just super quickly, what would you say are the top 3 that are currently not being addressed to get women cycling, or not being addressed enough, perhaps?
At risk of kind of repeating myself, women is a very broad group, right? There are disabled women, there are women of different classes, different nationalities, different ability level on cycling. One woman's barriers to another's are not the same, and that is the crux of this conversation. We have to understand this woman's barriers and this woman's barriers and address them directly, rather than treating huge groups, more than 50% of the population as one entity, and thinking that we're going to be able to get this whole huge group with a completely different experience, completely different travel patterns, completely different barriers, all cycling through the same top 3 actions. It's just not going to work. And this is where this aggregated data and skewing funding towards those that are underfunded and underrepresented is really key. Yeah. So there isn't a simple.
Sorry if my question was misinterpreted, Georgia, because at no point am I suggesting that there is top 3 things that's going to cover everyone at all, 100%. But is the part of the problem that we just don't have that data, disaggregated, amalgamated, whichever? Do we not have the data that is looking at all the different subgroups and intersectionalities that women face and all the rest of it that you're talking about? I completely accept all of that. But I still am struggling from a policymaker's point of view. We need specificity, and we need, what are the things that I'm an Oxford MP. We know that the government's interested in potentially pumping some money to make Oxford and surrounding areas a cycling city. I don't want it to be a cycling city just for wealthy, middle-class, abled men. I want it to be something, and I'm hearing that the way we do that is we include more women, and actually we're very lucky to have the main council leaders, and indeed most of the CEOs are women. So in Oxford, we are going to have that representation, which is great, or at least some of it. But what is the data showing us that is currently being unaddressed?
So I would almost throw that question back to you. Does Oxford have the data? Because it's about whether you have the data in Oxford, and this is the point that I think Kirsty was making about in Stoke. Does Stoke have the data? Does Oxford? The data might be different from one to the other, right? So the question really sits with the local authority. Do you have the data and the visibility of the different groups that are there, or are we looking at it just on that kind of higher top level? And I think more often than not, we do have the data, but we're not necessarily being led by it, and we're not using it for our decision making. So when we're introducing new services and we're doing consultation, hopefully that there's consultation happening, that we're making sure that that is skewed towards who are we actually trying to serve here, and who needs to be in this conversation, so that we are taking 20% of feedback from this group and 50% of feedback from this group that's underserved. So it's not necessarily about not having the data. Often the data is there, but actually utilizing it for the decision making.
Thank you. Is there anywhere that's best practice that we can look to? Any council areas?
I do think. Yeah, I think there are loads of councils that are doing really great work with this, particularly around the consultation piece. There are lots of new platforms that are being built to enable public consultation. This is also happening in the private sector. I think there's more and more of a push for private businesses to do more consultation before bringing their services in, and working with local groups and really tailoring the service to the local area. So I definitely see that there's a lot of progress on this. And I do think as well, with the current, I'm going to sound, this is of course with my tier hat on, with the current e-scooter trials, it's offering a really, really interesting approach that hasn't been taken before, of a really kind of detailed and thoughtful and slow and cautious rollout that's taking a lot of data in before taking the next steps. And I think across micromobility and across transport as a whole, we can learn a lot from that, actually taking on the data and doing the learning and actually feeding that back into how you deliver the service consistently, rather than a kind of, we're going to deliver this service and then it's there and then it's done and then it's over and this is how it looks. But actually that continual improvement and iteration is something that we can learn from across the sector as a whole.
Thank you very much. Back to Chair.
Thank you very much, Lola, and thank you. It's clear from this that there is so much to hear in this space, and so I've been given Chair's permission to hang on to you for a couple more minutes if you're all able to say. So what I think we'd be keen to understand is if we were to have each of you to give us one key takeout from this, or maybe two, absolute push. So to give you each a couple of minutes just to really summarise what you think we should take from it. Now, I understand what you've said already about sort of the diversity of groups that we're talking about, and that actually when we start to talk specifically about women, there's obviously a lot of us. Lovely to see so many of us this morning, but this is obviously such a key area, and I think it is. I also sit on the Work and Pensions Select Committee, so it is an area that I hear a lot about, that we're not always getting our policies right or understanding the diversity as we head into them. So I'd be really interested to hear from each of you with just a sort of 90 seconds to 2 minutes of your thoughts of what we as policymakers should really take away from this for you. Hey, did you want to go first?
Okay, so I think immediate things that you could take away is infrastructure, including pavement infrastructure, cost and financial barriers, thinking particularly about disabled people. But I think there is a bigger picture, and that does involve all of this making sense with what other government departments are doing. So it's no good trying to get disabled people into active travel if the DWP is going to take your benefits off you, or the NHS won't give you a decent wheelchair or won't let you put a hand cycle on it. So I think there needs to be a much more joined up understanding of where disabled people fit into society more broadly, as well as just in terms of things like active travel and transport. And I think also the broader public transport issue. I mean, public transport is on the whole not accessible. It's not accessible for disabled people, and we can't be demanding disabled people get out of cars and start cycling on the unaffordable cycle when you still can't get on most trains or off a lot of stations, or, you know. And again, I think we need to think about the whole country. Some areas are very well resourced in terms of public transport, particularly London. The rest of us, you know, if you can't get on the bus because there's a buggy in the wheelchair space, it's not like another's going to be along in 10 minutes. It's probably an hour before another bus comes along, and then the ramp is broken, etc., etc. So we've really got to think about the national picture really varies, and we can't just always be targeting at the people who have the most mobility privilege and the highest level of resources. We've got to start targeting where there is least. Otherwise, we're just creating massive inequalities, and we're literally pushing some people out of public space. And we've got to really work really hard to reverse that. And that starts with all of those people who are currently excluded being in the conversation from the very beginning, not afterwards, not when the mistakes are made, from the very beginning. When you've got an idea, don't go anywhere with it till you've got a really diverse group of people working on it.
Thank you, Kay. And I think as an MP for a very rural constituency where public transport is sparse would be a generous description. The problem's even worse. So, Kirsty, a final thought from you.
Sure. Equality and impact assessments, please. We really need these to step up. One of the ways that we've influenced local authorities is by using the private sector. I'll be very honest. I think the public sector's got a lot to learn from organisations like TIA, and others. I think that there's far more investment. There are more up-to-date skills and a more progressive approach to equality. There's also a less defensive approach, I find, from the private sector than the public sector. There's a big skills gap in local authorities in understanding their local communities and in not applying that equality and impact assessment process properly. So that's really my number one takeaway, is looking at that filtering process for those impact assessments.
Thank you, Kirsty. And Georgia, final thought from you.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to say disaggregated data, really important, but being community led, ensuring that we're not in situations where all of our decision makers are not representative of the communities that we're building for. And that means, you know, if that is the case, making sure that those people are doing their due diligence and consultation to bring the community into the conversation. And at the same time, making sure that we have representatives that are, you know, within those communities in the decision-making spaces, being funded, having the ability to start new businesses, innovate, and build things for their communities as well.
Thank you all so much. It's been a really interesting and informative session, and I think we could have actually spoken to you all morning. So thank you for condensing your answers and really helping us to better understand this space. But I do hope if there's other things you'd like to add to our inquiry that you are back in touch with us. So thank you all. And we're moving on to the second theme of this morning, which is around strategies that achieve behaviour change. And that evidence shows it's not particularly easy to get people walking or cycling. But as we've seen through the pandemic, there are occasions when behaviour does change. And I am going to welcome our next witness, who is Dr. David Ogilvy, to introduce himself and then hand back over to Layla, who'll be asking the first question. David, there you are. You've moved on my screen. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm a doctor, originally trained in general practice and then in public health. Now I specialise in public health research, and I lead a programme of research in Cambridge, focusing generally on how we could use environmental and policy approaches to shifting population health for the better, with a specific interest in transport and physical activity.
Thank you very much, David. So we often talk about this space under the umbrella term of active travel, but of course that encompasses a number of different things. And my question is, does the what works in growing walking also work in growing cycling? And if not, how should those differences be catered for?
Well, I think we heard already in this session, in the discussion about inclusion, an eloquent way of putting the difference between amplified and non-amplified ways of traveling, for example, walking, but also manual wheelchairs compared with cycling or e-bikes and so forth. I think it's clear that there are some aspects at the street level where different users can come into conflict. That needs to be considered in design. But more generally, I think I notice in the call out for evidence for this inquiry a reference to cycling being seen as easier to cater to. And I wonder if that reflects an assumption that there are specific kinds of infrastructure that we can envisage and provide for cyclists, and therefore an assumption perhaps that what walking needs is just pavements, but it really isn't that simple. I would argue that the principles for promoting both are really the same, and they are at a higher order than the street level. They are to do with design and planning at the settlement and city level. So, for example, for both walking and cycling, what you need is destinations you can go to within a reasonable distance, and you can get there in a convenient and safe way. And while the distance thresholds for the two modes of travel are different, those principles are the same, and therefore an urban design strategy, for example, that considers the distribution of employment, distribution of housing, public transport networks, population density, and all of those issues will, if it's implemented thoughtfully, support the growth of both modes.
Thank you very much. So a very quick follow-up on that. So do you think that, so for example, in Oxfordshire, we've got two-tier councils. One is responsible for infrastructure and that sort of wider strategic bit. The other is responsible for local plans and housing. And sometimes the two don't meet. Is that one of the things that you think government at a national level should be looking at trying to address and bring those together? Or is that something that actually can already happen under the current system?
Well, I mean, obviously in different parts of the country, there are different arrangements in terms of unitary authorities and so forth. And I wouldn't claim to be an expert on the pros and cons of different ways of organizing those functions between different tiers. But in general, I would say that for this topic in general, collaboration between disciplines, whether within one level or between tiers, is essential. Most of the topics we're talking about relate within a local authority, for example, to the planning department and the transport department and the public health department. They have to work together to address these issues because the outcomes of more thoughtful design will benefit multiple different sectors.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So my question was, what is known about how social, spatial and environmental context influence the effectiveness of interventions in this space?
Well, I have to say that's a pretty large question. So I'll offer a few sort of headlines and maybe we can pick out the ones that would be most useful to drill into. In terms of the social context, I think it's important to remember, and this perhaps relates to some of the discussion earlier about gender and cycling, for example, that walking and cycling trips are not discrete behaviors. They form part of wider social practices. So how one person travels to work may be related to whether they need to collect a child from school or go shopping or all of those other things. So we need to consider the social realities of how and why people make their travel choices. Walking is, for some sections of society, not a discretionary choice, but it's an unavoidable reality if you can't afford the alternatives. And some of the data on trends in travel behavior during and after lockdowns around the world has shown social differentials in how people's walking and cycling behaviors have changed over time. Cycling, as we've already heard, can be perceived as being not for us, for some groups in society, but it's important to recognize that's not immutable. And comparisons both within this country and with other countries show that, for example, if you come to Cambridge, where I work, you will see people of all ages on bikes and on often quite ordinary bikes in a way that's not seen in every part of the country. You'll see a higher prevalence of female cyclists than in other parts of the country. And some international comparative work recently has shown that in countries or cities around the world where the overall share of trips for cycling is above a certain threshold, the gender balance is much closer to parity than it is in areas where the total prevalence is low. On the environmental and spatial angle, I think the key spatial point is distance. If it's too far to walk or cycle, then obviously the likelihood that someone will make a journey by those modes of transport falls off sharply with distance. But one of the things we showed in our research in Cambridge, but it's not unique to Cambridge, is that if there's good public transport within the mix, the distance is no longer an object to including walking and cycling in the commute, for example. We've shown people who are traveling to work using methods like park and ride, but they actually walk or cycle the last stage of the journey to work, or public transport with walking or cycling at one or both ends of the journey. They are including substantial amounts of physical activity in their commute with a meaningful health related dose across the week. So unless we're going to move large numbers of people closer to work or work closer to home, public transport is critical to making it more possible for more people to do more active travel. More broadly in the environmental area, some interventions' effectiveness will be modified or impaired by other things going on in people's environment that constitute a tide they need to swim against. This might include high relative cost of public transport, low relative cost of parking, danger from motor vehicles, these kind of issues. Something we've been looking at in our research on infrastructure interventions more recently is trying to distill what are the key underlying functions that an effective environmental change offers that seems critical to success. And it is increasingly boiling down to improving accessibility and connectivity, as well as safety from motor vehicles. But of course, sometimes an infrastructure project, including some of the ones we've studied, they generate an increase in walking and maybe cycling, but not necessarily in modal shift away from the car, because they're turning out to attract more recreational than transport use. While that's fine and a good outcome in itself, it illustrates that if the infrastructure isn't fully addressing the local environmental reality of where people live and where they need to go, the potential mode shift is limited until you have a dense, comprehensive network that serves everywhere that people want to go.
Thank you for covering so much in that. I know exactly what you mean about Cambridge, having studied there myself, and the multimodal solutions I think is vital. And again, we're back in rural constituencies where distance is such an immense issue, as it's a good 20 miles for lots of my constituents to actually get to the supermarket. So the next question again is quite broad, top level. But what is our understanding, or even better, your understanding from the research of the best balance between investing in infrastructure and in so-called complementary measures? So by that, I mean things like marketing, personal travel planning, training, and bike subsidies.
Yeah, so I would use the word synergy rather than balance. When I started looking into this topic in my PhD in Glasgow some time ago, most of the available evidence was about individual behavior change strategies like personalized travel planning. There was a smattering of evidence for other approaches, most of it very weak in scientific quality. And in the intervening 15 or 20 years, we've tried to gradually build up a more complete evidence base across the range of potential solutions. To go reductio ad absurdum for a moment, if we only used a kind of individual psychology approach, we'd be limited by the fact that people need capacity, opportunity, and motivation to respond to those approaches. And those commodities are not equally distributed in the population, and they tend to be concentrated in people who are already better off and in better health. And among other things, if your local environment or your living circumstances are not conducive to supporting a move towards active travel, there's limits to what you as a personal participant can do to respond to those prompts. So in the interest of both effectiveness and sustainable change and equitable outcomes, we need to complement that more individual or household level targeted approach with solutions at different levels in the environment, ranging from the local, street level design through spatial planning, as I've described, up to national policy as it relates to things like fuel prices or how public transport is managed and funded. We have shown that infrastructure projects can achieve similar effect sizes in terms of the amount of mode shift or the amount of physical activity gain to more targeted behavior change programs that were previously the dominant type of evidence in the scientific literature. And so it's important to recognize that, I think, because of course, when we're applying infrastructure change to an area, the whole population is the catchment and potentially can respond, not only the people who opt in to respond to a marketing campaign or something.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Baroness Barker, who I've seen doing some active travel around her office in that last session. Well done. Thank
you very much indeed. This time I'm going to talk about balance because I think it's appropriate. What's your understanding about the balance between making walking and cycling active travel more attractive and on the other hand, making using cars less attractive?
Sure. So I think the answer is, again, more of the evidence in the scientific literature historically and still now has been on the what we might call the carrot approach rather than the stick. But as I've said, not only is the potential population impact of carrots limited by other aspects of people's circumstances, we also have the major problem of externalities, which applies in various policy areas. But in this case, it's to do with the fact that my decision to drive a car affects your propensity to get on a bike or even to cross the road as a pedestrian. And, as we've seen in the current debate about masks, it's a limited approach to focus only on encouraging people to do more of one thing without considering the impact of everyone else's behavior. What we're finding in our most recent work, trying to synthesize evidence across the field on this, is that there may be more evidence in terms of amount on the carrot approaches. There's less available on the stick or the carrot plus stick combined approaches, but what evidence there is in the latter groups may be more consistent. One of the problems here is that people like me who want to evaluate interventions or strategies in this area cannot introduce them ourselves. We depend on local governments or national governments or other organizations to implement things that we can evaluate. And so to understand more about the real impact of measures to encourage people out of their cars, which might be financial, like congestion charging, or they might be to do with convenience, for example, modal filtering to make it less convenient to drive in a straight line through a city. We need more jurisdictions to implement things in a way that can be rigorously evaluated so that we can build more evidence, both about the benefits, but also about potential harms and ways of mitigating those. For example, as we heard earlier, possible impacts on people who need to use cars because of their disability.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really helpful. And so I suppose one of the things that we ought to be calling for in our strategy is much more evaluation being attached to schemes implemented by different authorities, yes?
Yes, I mean, I would say that in the last decade, we have grown a much stronger evidence base within the UK of the potential benefits of infrastructural and policy interventions. Prior to that, most of the available evidence in that territory came from other countries. And while that's certainly relevant, we can now increasingly show that we can obtain similar benefits by doing similar things in this country. But it remains the case that some things have been more evaluated than others. And if we persist in just doing more of the things that we've already evaluated at length, we do risk perpetuating a kind of bias whereby we don't try things that might be even more effective because we're a bit scared of them. There are ways of implementing, progressive policies and strategies that can be done in a way to gain public support, to frame them in a way that isn't perceived as a war on the motorist. In some cases, for example, things have been implemented explicitly as a trial, evaluated, and then put out to a public vote to see to the extent to which people agree with the real experience of the policy rather than what was projected in advance.
Thank you. That's really helpful. A final question from me. How accurately is it possible to estimate the investment necessary to get cycling and walking rates up to the level of growth which is envisaged by government?
Well, I'm afraid by me, it's not possible. I think I'm neither an economist nor a modeler. I don't feel I have the expertise to answer that question, sorry.
Fair enough, but we need that data. So who would be able to answer that question, do you think?
Maybe I'll communicate offline afterwards about that.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Back to Celine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just one final question whilst we've got you and your experience. How applicable is the experience of other countries in growing active travel to the case of England?
It's definitely applicable. I think there's two sides to this. There's sort of provision of inspiration, but also the need to validate locally what we infer from other places. So as I've said, when I began looking at this topic area, especially the infrastructure side of things, I was looking at studies from countries like Denmark and the Netherlands. Now, they are not a million miles away in any sense, topography, climate, wealth, etc., but they are perhaps culturally different. I think those are increasingly informing policy and practice here. We've seen the Mini Holland label, for example, attached to low traffic neighborhoods in London. That kind of exemplifies where the inspiration comes from. At the same time, another of our recent studies has shown that for some policymakers and practitioners, it's important to have believable stories from just down the road. And that's one of the reasons why we've tried to build up a comparable UK evidence base for similar kind of strategies. And we are finding that they do work here as well. And one of the things we have been working towards is trying to understand what are the common core underlying functions that effective strategies achieve that could be achieved by a variety of specific solutions in different places. And actually, NICE guidance on this topic has put this fairly explicitly for a long time now. So, for example, if we are talking about improving safety for motor vehicles as a key function of effective interventions, in one place, the solution might be a segregated cycle lane or segregated mobility lane. In another place, it might be traffic calming or speed limits. There's always going to need to be locally tailored solutions. And that applies within this country, but also comparison with other countries. I think we are beginning to show that there are common themes for effective interventions in different places, and we can, as it were, localize the specific solutions in pursuit of those common aims.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear your evidence this morning. Really grateful to you for coming along and joining us. And so we're now going to move on to the final phase of this morning's inquiry, which is effective programme and planning management, which obviously is fundamental to CWIS2. And it is obviously a series of complex programmes, and we need central government and delivery agencies to have the right techniques and skills to deliver this. So delighted to welcome this morning Andy Murray, who's the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. So I'm going to hand over to you, Andy, to introduce yourself, and then Fabian will be asking the first questions.
Great, thank you, Selene. Yes, my background is around 30 years in project and program management, as a practitioner delivering projects, but also as an advisor and assurer. And I've had a hand in developing various amounts of best practice guidance that many of our practitioners in this country follow.
Andy, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And this is our last session of this last week of interviews. I wonder if you could tell us what best practice in project and program management can teach us about investing to grow walking and cycling across England.
Yes, so I've tried to think about the challenges that projects which aim to grow walking and cycling have in order to think about which best practices can help. I've sort of gone back to sort of first principles, if you like, to answer this question. So I've broken down, if you want to break down projects and programs into some parts to help, then essentially we're talking about sort of pre-project, making the initial decision to invest in a project and doing the evaluation. There's the delivery itself, and then there's the benefits realization, the post-project activities. And if I think about cycling and what I've understood from like the gear change vision, I think the delivery side, the implementation is relatively straightforward. I think that's, it's well understood, the civils side of the work that needs to be done to deliver cycling infrastructure. And there are some challenges, like, for example, sometimes you might need to reroute utilities, and there's clearly limited road space that needs to be understood. But these things are understood, and in terms of how other schemes are delivered. So I think if we accept that part is sort of relatively routine, the projects are no different to other projects, then I think a key challenge really is in that pre-project in terms of justifying the investment using sort of traditional investment appraisal and business case techniques. So I may be sort of answering your question in a slightly different way, which is not sort of how best practice can help, but perhaps how best practice might need to change in order to help. So if we look at sort of traditional investment appraisal and business case techniques, then in terms of the if we take the Treasury's Green Book, there's what we call the 5-case model, and there's different lenses against which you view a project. So there's a strategic case, and I think that's relatively straightforward again to apply to walking and cycling schemes. The case is very well set out in the gear change guidance in terms of environmental and health benefits and other benefits that can be gained. But when we start then to look at the economic and financial cases, I think we can then struggle to make the case for individual schemes. And if we just give some examples, I think that's where the delivery agencies may not directly monetize or have an economic benefit out of some of the schemes that they would want to put in place. Now then they're having to rely on the strategic case to say, but we have to do it. It's a justified because of other reasons. And we've often seen that, for example, where there's safety issues or accidents where a new scheme is put in place to alleviate those, and it's not done for other reasons. But when we look at that sort of the existing sort of measures used to evaluate schemes, and I had a short period of time working with Transport for London, and at the time it was principally sort of average journey time was the overarching factor that got used. Then you can then see the challenges, because we might be adding, taking away a bit of road space for one mode that's going to impact on journey times of another mode. And the best practice guidance on business case appraisal is that we would take all of those into consideration, and what we gain in one area will net off the disbenefits of another area, and we use that to make our decision. Now, what then happens when you do that at a portfolio level? You end up with individual projects that don't compare well to others, and it means that you then disproportionately, approve different types of schemes. So I think that there's a need to look at that. The other challenge, I think, again, it's where best practice might need to reconsider things, is that the justification is often made, or the business case is made at the investment level, and that can mean that we end up trying to justify elements of a wider scheme, of, a wider thing we're trying to undertake at too low a level, where we then try to say, well, what's the impact of this part? Is actually quite difficult to prove the causality between doing an intervention and the benefits that you may get, because actually it's the overall system that you're putting in place that's going to deliver those benefits. So again, I think there's a need for the types of schemes that I've seen proposed in gear change to bring up the investment decision to a higher level rather than trying to do it at too low a level. That said, I think there are cases where you need to ensure that lots of individual schemes can be knitted together to give you the overarching transport effect, but trying to do the justification on smaller schemes, I think, can be challenging.
Andy, that's very, sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry,
No, I was just going to say that's very helpful. You've partly brought me into the next question I wanted to ask you, which perhaps you could sort of seamlessly integrate with your current answer. I mean, I was going to go on to ask what the optimal division of tasks and responsibilities between central government and delivery agencies should be. I mean, you've started actually answering that question. Perhaps you'd like to continue.
Yeah, so I've been talking about sort of levels there, if you like, and so I think the division of labour is definitely one of, we talk about projects which deliver an output, delivering an outcome, but typically they're quite well defined, and you can specify them and you can prove whether you've delivered them or not when they're finished. That can roll up into a program of work where there's multiple projects, and it's the collective of the changes you're putting in place that deliver you outcomes that give you the benefits that you're seeking in sort of the vision type views. And then there's the portfolio level, which is looking at the totality of all the different things you're looking to put in place. And I think that's the division of labour, really. That portfolio level needs to sit with central government, and in particular providing what I would call that top level cover on the business case. So if you can get to a position where certain types of schemes are pre-justified in terms of, because they're meeting that strategic case, then the economic and financial aspects are less about whether to do something, but it's more about how you're going to do it. So you're doing your sort of value for money on the option rather than whether you're going to go ahead with something or not. And I think that's something that would help. I think there's also a need for government to set some guidance, or central government to set some guidance around the sort of portfolio parameters. So that's where you're looking at not the alignment of an individual scheme to the portfolio, but the fit of a scheme to a portfolio. So how does it contribute to the other aspects of things that are going on overall? So how do you join up schemes, if you like? And then the delivery agencies, theirs is more one then about that program level and the delivery focus. And the work I think the delivery agencies can do is more with each other, which is around collaborating on standards. I think we heard some of that earlier with one of your other witnesses around, sort of pavements and surfaces and so on. But, the delivery agencies can collaborate on those things. They can enable reuse of designs. They can share lessons and data, and they can also do a lot more planning ahead. So, for example, work on utilities. If we know that there's some work going ahead on some aspects, then how can you join those up to get the opportunity of doing some work when you've got possession of an asset?
Yeah, good point, actually. That sort of perhaps leads me into my final question to you, which is, how do you think performance management in particular should be carried out? I mean, I'm thinking of sort of the delivery agencies and central government, the split there between them on performance management particularly.
Yeah, this is problematic. So Because if you've got an overarching objective, for example, 80% journeys being sustainable, then the delivery agencies would want to be ensuring that their current business as usual activities, they understand what they are, and then they also understand the mix of new things they're putting in place and how that would affect that as an overarching measure. So in terms of how government may wish to, if you like, hold the delivery agencies to account, it's understanding that they have that roadmap that's in place where they can determine or forecast the impact of schemes against some of those overarching objectives.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm going to hand over now to Baroness Barker. Liz.
Hi, thank you very much. And given where the delivery agencies sit in the midst of all of this, what skills do you think that they need in order to manage complex programs?
Yeah, so I think there's some, there's obviously the underlying project program management skills, but I think just focusing on those alone, I think you need more than that to address some of the challenges that I can see here. And I think some of the principal ones are around systems thinking, so that you don't get drawn into designing schemes and delivering them on their own, but you think of the totality of the system. We had, I think, from one of your other witnesses talking about where, walking and cycling may be part of a journey rather than the totality of the journey in itself. So if you understand those different, use cases, if you like, then you can model them and you can understand things like unintended consequences of, causing new rat runs or whatever that might come from introducing a new scheme. So I think there's definitely some skills that the agencies need to improve that understanding of how systems, and particularly systems as systems, work well together. Your last witness, I think really brought to life the need for that sort of change management, the behaviour aspect, and I think that's something the delivery agencies can spend, need more skills on. So, and that's understanding, how to engage with different user or stakeholder groups to influence choices that they can make. And then the last skill set, I think that in addition to sort of regular project program management that would help the delivery agencies is a greater focus around benefits management and benefits realization, and so that you can get linked with that change management and understanding of how you measure and then attribute the impact of change.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to hand over to Selene to take us through to the end. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Andy, for those answers. The final question I've got is, what skills do you think central government needs to sponsor and oversee complex programmes?
Yes, so I've talked about portfolio management earlier, and I think that's definitely an area that would help government to oversee and sponsor the complex programs that they'll then ask the delivery agencies to undertake on their behalf. I think within that, I mentioned it earlier about that, making sure that the portfolio has a balance. So if there's a mechanism against which transport schemes are evaluated, it can lead to some, what I would call a skewed portfolio. I've seen it in other domains where, there's an overarching approach. Projects get put forward and you end up with all one types coming through because the appraisal mechanism favours a particular type of project. You get an imbalanced portfolio. So I think there's some skills required there for central government, and then I think there's also some skills around the business case in terms of reconsidering the appraisal methods, so that particularly where they're asking delivery agencies to undertake projects where there might be a disbenefit to them in terms of, say, fare box income, how they go about ensuring that those projects then still go ahead by those delivery agencies. And then the last one, I think, as a skill for skill or capability for central government for me is around data sharing and data analytics, because otherwise it's too easy for lots of the analysis that needs to be done to be difficult, because the data sat in silos, either within individual delivery agencies or indeed their contractors. So I think there's a role for the central government and a skill set needed around understanding data, understanding how to set some policies and guidance about making sure it's captured in the first place and then shared for those who need it.
Thank you. And whilst I've got you, if I can take the liberty of an extra question, Active Travel England is being created to act as commissioning body, funding body and inspectorate. What would your advice be to the DfT to make the best of this new arrangement?
Well, I'd like to relay an outcome or a conversation that we've had with our members. So the association's members, we had a number of roundtable discussions last year in response to the project pace and the project speed gauntlet that was thrown down about how to speed up projects to enable economic recovery. And one of those roundtable discussions we had was the role of regulators in helping projects and in terms of their pace. And the discussions we were having across our members was ensuring that regulators such as say OR, the Office of Rail and Road, getting involved earlier in projects and getting involved in the initiation activities. And I think if you got it as a commissioning body, funding body, and inspector, I know it's not quite the same as a regulator, but there are some examples. The Better Value Railway, for example, where OR, Department for Transport and Network Rail are all working together to look at how that those sort of schemes can work. So getting involved with the delivery agencies early, I think is would be my advice, or the advice that came out of our roundtable rather.
Thank you, Andy. That's really helpful. And that draws us to a close of today's session. So a big thank you to everyone for coming to give us their views today. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you to the other parliamentarians on the call for making this possible, and a massive thank you to Adam from our Secretariat and Tom, who are in the background, and all the work they've done to pull this inquiry together. And if anyone does have further evidence they'd like to submit, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So thank you everyone for your time this morning, and please do enjoy the sunshine over the weekend and get out for some active travel. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much.